Signal Sciences is the industry's first web protection platform that works in any cloud, any container, any platform as a service, and any modern application architecture. The Signal Sciences web protection platform can be deployed in next-generation WAF, RASP, or reverse proxy modes, giving customers ultimate flexibility and coverage. Protect your web applications with Signal Sciences web protection platform. Signal Sciences, protecting applications, connecting teams. For more information, check them out at signalsciences.com/PSW. Welcome back, everyone, to Application Security Weekly. I almost forgot what show I was on there for a minute. I'll be okay, though. Thank you to our sponsors, IT Pro TV. We use them, and you should, too. Also, make sure you check out our on-demand website where you can register and listen/watch to watch the several webcasts that are there, including one on the state of penetration testing with John Strand and myself, securityweekly.com/on-demand. Keith, back to you.
Very cool. Very cool. So, by the way, I don't know if we have to mention InfoSec World, but I know that you and I are going to be there. Beautiful Lake Buena Vista, Florida, March 19th to the 21st. It's going to be pretty great. I myself am a huge fan of Disney World in general, but especially InfoSec conferences in March in Orlando, because it is just a beautiful time to be there. So I look forward to it. I know that, Paul, you and I are both speaking. We also have some other excellent speakers: Adriana Sanabria, Diana Kelly and Ed Moyle, Jennifer Manella, Joseph Zacharias, Mark Arnold, who was on PSW last night, as well as Matthias Madhu, who we interviewed last week, and Summer Fowler. So it's going to be a really great time with a lot of pretty intelligent and exciting people to be hanging out with. So I look forward to it.
Did you say Adriana Sanabria?
Adrian.
Just checking. Just checking.
So now when I have to go introduce myself to Adrian, I have to apologize profusely, because if I did say Adriana,
I think you did. It's okay.
So I did it live. What can I say? We pushed to master.
He has long hair, so I get it. It's fine.
I think the beard gives it away, though. That's usually what I would say.
Just kidding. So. Love you, Adrian. So what do we got in the news for this week?
Oh, man, it's a little bit of a train wreck, I would say. Dumpster fire is a good way to describe news this week. So first of all, Microsoft has started to block the Spectre Variant 2 patches from being updated or added to your systems because Intel has reported issues with it that include unpredictable behavior, such as reboots, slow loading times, and data loss or corruption. The data loss thing concerns me, especially considering that that's usually to disk or to memory. And the fact that they're having data loss or corruption take place as a result of this patch seems real bad. What are your thoughts there, Paul?
So I have a question. Microsoft released a patch that blocks Intel's patch. Is that how I understand it? Now, How do you get... So I have lots of questions. How do you get Intel's patch? Is that from your motherboard manufacturer, or is that directly from Intel? That would be my
understanding, because Intel has pushed back on the we're not providing patches. We are giving these kind of patches or this information to the third parties, so Dell, HP, Lenovo, etc.
And I'm sure if we
patch.
build most of our systems here, so I'm assuming your motherboard or computer manufacturer, in whichever case you fall in, would then push a patch down through the crappy drivers that they usually give you that are associated with the system that patches the firmware on the chips, physically on the chips. Is that true?
Yep.
Okay.
Yep, that would be my understanding as well. So basically Microsoft has said, look, this patch or this series of patches that are coming out are a train wreck, and they're ruining people's systems, for lack of a better term, or people's experience of their systems. So we're just going to put a kibosh on that until we get this all figured out, which doesn't really give me a lot of hope for the situation, given that they've known about this, or at least Intel has known about this since last June.
Yeah, so how does Microsoft block the patch from Intel, or do they just work around it?
Honestly, that they don't really go into. Unfortunately, I didn't personally go in and reverse engineer the patch that they ended up pushing out. But my understanding would be it's probably something to do with their operating system level controls of, if you are trying to interact with the firmware or the chipset in the following way, we will prevent that kernel level call or kernel level execution from taking place.
Gotcha.
So, The other interesting side of this, continuing with the Spectre meltdown situation, which I thought was somewhat interesting, was that Intel warned Chinese companies of the flaw before the US government. Now, US CERT was a part of the kind of alerting mechanism that came out as a result of this, but it's interesting kind of from two different perspectives. Of course, there's the political concern that if the Chinese government knew about it before our government, then they could have a head start on developing, malware or tool sets to make or take advantage of this. The other side of it, though, and this makes a lot of sense, is that quite frankly, all these chips are produced in China. So of
Yes.
course they had to let those
The
companies know
manufacturer
first,
know.
right?
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's just an overblown headline. I think Intel, in the interest of getting this fixed, had to tell their chip company manufacturers, which all probably 100% are in China, although I'm just making that up, but I'm sure the vast majority of them are made in China, which means they get to know first so they can push out a fix. Of course, the other flip side to that, like you said, Keith, is because of the political climate in China, that means the Chinese government knows about it before the U.S. government.
So yeah, you're right. Overblown is a good way to describe the headline per se, but it plays on that very real problem of who knows about what when. And so to the extent that Intel has known about this for a long time, Microsoft probably knew about it shortly thereafter. They haven't given a timeline as to when the major operating systems were notified of this vulnerability and starting to make those kernel level patches. But to that end, it's kind of like, you've known about it for a long time. Who knew about it first doesn't really matter now in retrospect because people are starting to push out patches, but then we're finding that those patches are not good. So people are now being told not to patch. The interesting side of this that is now making the situation that much worse is independent AV companies, so AV Test and Fortinet specifically, are starting to detect malware, and in this case, 139 unique malware samples as of January 31st, that are attempting to make use of the JavaScript-based proof of concept in an extended version to actually use those vulnerabilities against people. I mean, talk about worst case scenario coming to life. Paul, what are your thoughts?
I think, in the way I've been describing this, and I want to get your feedback on it, is like you're damned if you do and you're damned if you don't. If you apply the patches, we've covered several articles in different aspects that like basically your systems, ironically enough, melt down. And if you don't apply the patch, well, then there's going to be malware that's attacking your system. So it's like pick your poison. Like what do you want to do? I really don't have any good advice for people on this. I'm at a loss. Like I don't know what to tell people to do. Apply the patch, don't apply the patch. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, and really, this is a problem for desktop-based systems, I think, at this point, because let's face it, the cloud providers have patched their systems, and even though that's had an effect on performance to some degree in terms of CPU utilization, it's now more or less taken care of for those systems. So now it's a internal local environment situation, right? Like you're thinking about your servers, your desktops, your end users, especially if it's malware. It's, heaven forbid, dropping something that's like a Bitcoin miner, for example, or ransomware, which would be even worse.
Well, yeah, and there's less overhead to play with on end user systems versus if you're looking at your cloud architecture, you likely know how much headroom you have on average on your CPU cycles in the cloud, and you can manage that. In fact, you can throw more resources at it if you need to. On the desktop, it's a single static system, or if you just take one, for example, a user uses a static system that you don't know how much headroom they have on there. So if you apply this patch, it may mean they can't do their job.
Right, exactly. And so to some extent, I would say that protect your critical users. And so look at maybe, rolling out a test bed of patches to your administrators, your sysadmins, your people that run the servers that are privileged. Maybe look at some of the people in finance, for example, because those people handle the money. But to the extent that you're right, like if I have a broad set of office managers, people that work the phones, people that maybe develop some software, I may or may not push out the patch to different groups based on the criticality of the work that they do. If I'm a software company and my developers are touching the code that is making my business profitable, I might push a patch to them or have a test bed set of patches that I would push out to a few of them to see how it goes. But yeah, it's not going to be pretty when this stuff starts to actually land and connect. I think that right now what it is it's more or less these different malware creators or malware developers that are testing to see how they can leverage this.
Hmm.
When someone actually bundles this in a way that has impact, that's when we'll start to see things get serious, is my kind of feeling. But for now, patch where you can for the most critical users, and I don't know, hope for the best.
Or yeah, I mean, you
Uh,
can roll out all brand new i7 based laptop computers and send it to all of your employees. Of course, if you've got 5 or 10 employees, that is not as difficult as a task as if you have 100,000 employees, as some enterprises do, or more. That's obviously not feasible. So that's another reason that concerns me, that if this is going to impact the people who have slower computers more, having worked in IT, right? You too, Keith, and our listeners too, rolling out new systems to people is like there's so many things that go into that, and that's not something you can do quickly. Sometimes it's years before you do a refresh. Like I would talk to sales engineers from Cisco, and I'd be like, dude, your laptop is like so old. Like that just looks heinous. Is that like Windows 98? And they're like, yeah, dude, it takes Cisco like 3 years to push out an update to Windows 7 at the time. At the time, that's kind of what we're looking at. And I was like, wow, yeah, because if you think about it, how many hundreds of thousands of laptops do they have to push out? You can't just do that overnight.
right, right. And so yeah, I mean, to the extent that you got to triage where you can. So the other interesting thing that I just want to add as well is, according to Intel, at least they've said this, that they are going to be releasing new silicon chips this year, 2018, that mitigate against these vulnerabilities. So I can imagine that if you are the kind of person that likes to go to, I don't know, pawn shops or even kind of those different markets that will sell used hardware, you're probably going to be able to pick up some really nice servers in the next 6 to 8 months. Say, for example, MIT, I know, has a pretty big kind of resale market. So
yeah, it could have an interesting effect where people do refresh their hardware sooner rather than later. And even seventh gen Intel processors today are still pretty good. They're still pretty fast. I mean, you can use them for a lot of things. You don't necessarily have to be. Well, I guess this year's release, would that be is it a whole new generation? Is it a ninth gen, right? Because we're on 8th gen. Correct me if I'm wrong.
I believe it is a ninth gen, and it's going to be not against just their newest architecture, but also some of their older architectures as well. So like I think Kaby Lake is the newest one, and then Skylake is the one just before it. So they're going to be releasing new generations of those chipsets with the mitigations in place.
I got you. So we don't get a new.
Understanding.
Do we get a new Lake name or no?
I don't think so. Okay. Unfortunately, it would be nice though. Maybe we could call it, Glass Lake for the Meltdown. Yeah. I don't know.
It's the new Meltdown Lake processors.
Right. So moving on from this a little bit, though, I did want to get into the second section, which is the "If you build it, they will come" section of the news.
Oh, wait. No, I wanted to talk about PHP BB because I haven't heard that in a long time. And I feel like no one should be rolling their own deployment of a forum. You should just be using Reddit. And that's maybe I don't know. Is that?
Yeah.
Why would you have your own forum today when you can just create a subreddit? Or am I speaking out of turn? I don't know.
Well, maybe it's cost of doing business. Like that's the only thing that I can think of is either one, people don't want to pay Reddit to run some sort of private community, and quite frankly, I don't really know how that whole thing works in terms of like if you would have to pay or if you could create a private community. And the second thing is control, right? So now if I am putting information up on Reddit and it's an internal forum, and if I'm pushing my internal users to go to it, maybe not everyone has read like the compliance policy that you're not supposed to put the super secret sauce up on this private Reddit repo. Maybe someone accidentally makes it public. Like, can you reverse that? So running your own forum internally on your own servers behind the firewall is perhaps a bit dated thinking, but to that end, it has its place depending on the sensitivity of what you're using or what you're doing. Now, the worst part about this is the actual PHBB download links for 181 minutes, we're using a maliciously compiled version
Oh,
of the installer. So basically, and I don't know, it doesn't say how they actually detected this, but 181-minute turnaround time from detection that they've actually been delivering bad software that was maliciously compiled and then fixing it,
hmm.
uh, pretty good,
No,
I
that
would
is
say.
pretty.
But yeah,
It is pretty good, and I can see the use case now because, like, what are you going to do? You're going to write your own form software? Probably not. You can use what's in the cloud or public and get a private thing through Reddit. There's some cost with that. I don't know how familiar you are with commercial forum software, but Atlassian, great software company, makes some great, collaboration tools, but those are expensive as far as I know. Um, so I can see the use case where you're going to reach to open source because of all those reasons, but I think it's a lot less than it was before. Like back in the day, dating myself, when you wanted a forum, you went and got some crappy open source software and tried your best to secure it, and it almost always would get hacked and or abused in some way, right? Like how do you prevent against spam forum posts and things of that nature was always a challenge, which is why I think Reddit really took off in Facebook groups. But again, that still leaves use cases where you would have your own internal or controlled forum software. And then I don't know if you've ever looked at Atlassian, but awesome software, kind of pricey. If you're a large enterprise, sure, you make a business case for that. And I have used it in larger enterprises, and it's been pretty good. But that leaves the rest of us for PHPBB, which is just, it's so hard to secure that code base, right?
right,
Because you have to accept
right.
so much input from the user. And I feel like that's always been the downfall of forum software.
Well, Paul, couldn't you just use WordPress with some WordPress plugins?
Yeah, I mean, if you really want to get hacked, I don't know. I don't know.
Sorry,
If I
had to throw that
really
one out
wanted to
there.
get hacked, would I use PHP, BB, or WordPress? Maybe that's an exercise for our readers to weigh in on.
Right, right. Yes. Yeah. Email us, psw@securityweekly.com. Let us
Yeah.
know what you think, PHBB or WordPress with plugins, or, maybe something else that we're not thinking of. But yeah, so needless to say, they picked it up, which is awesome. They remediated that within 181 minutes of that actually occurring. And yeah, so to that end, good on them for fixing it and noticing it. So for being open source like that, I'm impressed that they have that kind of response time. Most big organizations don't. So
All right, let's talk about bypassing CloudFlare. That's kind of interesting.
this is one of my favorite ones in the news. So this is story number one under the "If you build it, they will come." So effectively, what has happened is a researcher named Christophe Tefani de Reaper, and this is something that's been somewhat well known in the bug bounty security community for a while, but he found that multiple websites using Cloudflare were misconfigured and allowed attackers to bypass the protection because of basically scanning of the internet. So
Mm.
things like Shodan or Census with a C
Mhm.
allow you to detect. Even VirusTotal does this actually, and this is one of the ones that I've gone to time and again whenever I find a site that's behind Cloudflare. Is if you go to something like VirusTotal and put in the actual URL, it will tell you previously known IP addresses of that server or domain before it was behind Cloudflare. So when you look back at the historical context of this information, you can say, okay, well, I can look at these set of domains because they're falling in the Cloudflare IP space, but this one before it probably is the actual server, so I'm going to try it.
Mhm.
And I found a number of open FTP servers that way. For example, it's just I can log in as anonymous and I can do sorts of things that I shouldn't be able to do, even if they're protected by Cloudflare, which by
You know,
itself is,
that's interesting, Keith. One of our sponsors, Domain Tools, has a tool called Iris. It gives you the exact same view. It's actually how they conduct a lot of their investigations by looking at the history of IP addresses and domains and making some assumptions. Oftentimes that leads to finding vulnerabilities or exposures, as we're disclosing here, or being able to identify and track some of the behaviors and habits of bad guys or gals. So it's interesting that, and I've always known this about load balancing, DDoS protection, right? If you can get around that somehow, and sometimes getting around that is just having some knowledge that, like you said, you can gain from Shodan or other tools, or even commercial tools from one of our sponsors to gain that information. It's just such an easy, it's not even really a hack, right? It's really more about OS int than it is about hacking.
And I would say, in addition to this, the nice thing about this article is the researcher doesn't just talk about how to get around Cloudflare, which is kind of the traditional mindset of where most offensive security people stop. They actually go on to talk about like things you should do to protect yourself,
Yeah,
and,
it's important.
for example, changing your actual IP address of that server after you're protected by Cloudflare is kind of like top of the list. So definitely go check it out. It's article number 1 under the "If you build it, they will come" section on the wiki. I do want to jump ahead though, Paul, because I think you covered this last night in Pulse Security Weekly, and it ties into the Lenovo story. So it looks like IBM conducted a study that said something like 42% of millennials use complex passwords, but people are converging on biometrics as kind of the means through which they will actually go ahead and authenticate to things. So I thought that that was interesting because, as you and I know, if you lose your biometrics, you can't easily replace that. So I'm curious to get your thoughts, especially because people of my generation seem to be moving in that direction somewhat haphazardly. And I'm curious to just get your thoughts on it.
Yeah, I think that we're moving from traditional passwords, multi-factor authentication, biometrics to something that combines some of that, but looks at user behavior and authenticates you based on behavior and other indicators about your location or access points that you're near or the way you hold your phone. And I know all of that sounds really scary and kind of like snake oil, but I've talked with people that really believe that this is the future, and I'm starting to latch onto it as an idea. Now, as I put my security hat on, I'm very concerned about how we would attack that specific kind of authentication, but it solves the problem that you mentioned, Keith, and that's one, like if I lose my multi-factor authentication, whatever that is, if that gets compromised in some way, like SMS authentication, or if it's some kind of biometrics that I can't change, that's certainly bad. But if it's just based on your behavior and that's what is helping to authenticate me, maybe in addition to a password, that's really cool, in my opinion, because it overcomes those problems of I lost my multi-factor authentication token, I lost my finger, or all of the other issues with biometrics, like your retinal scan changing and things of that nature. So we interviewed someone on that. I forget the name, but there's been a lot of people talking about it, and I think it does represent where we need to go in terms of adoption. I'm not so sure how that is going today, but I'm certainly really excited about moving away from all those traditional things that have so many issues into something that I'm authenticated because it can determine I'm me from environmental factors, for lack of a better term.
And the interesting part about that is that only becomes possible as computing speeds, read-write speeds in terms of disk and memory reach a certain threshold, right? Like they have to reach escape velocity before that even becomes possible. Because as the chip on your phone becomes more powerful, you can start to do things like reading for how you're holding it in your hand, or where you're physically located, or what the air pressure is around you, for example. So to that end, you're right. Like we probably are going to be moving through a phase of biometrics. I mean, we already see it right now with the iPhone X with the Face ID, for example. And at some point, I think that we will hit the point that you're talking of, which is maybe it's kind of a multi-factor of your thumbprint and the way in which you hold the phone when you're actually putting your thumbprint on there.
There needs to be a sensor on the phone that detects cigar smoke. And if there's no presence of cigar smoke, that's a factor to say, well, that's not really Paul.
Yeah, see? So air quality.
Yeah, air quality.
For lack of a better term. So the interesting part, and I know that we're getting close to wrapping up here, so I wanted to highlight just a couple more articles as well. But the thing that I find interesting about biometrics is Lenovo has shown us that storing biometrics is a bad idea. And in fact, their fingerprint readers on ThinkPads that were running Microsoft Windows 7, 8, and 8.1, which, to your point earlier, is probably most of the business community because they haven't updated to Windows 10, allowed you to steal, in this case, the password for Windows from the system itself, as well as the fingerprint data on the system, which you can't change unless you get some sort of plastic surgery maybe. So yeah, needless to say, the faster we move through this phase of people being infatuated with fingerprint readers and retina scans and face scans and into that behavioral, like locational based detection and authentication, the better.
I thought this story was kind of downplayed with the headlines that I was reading about it, in that Lenovo fixes hard code password flaw impacting fingerprint scanners. The real story is it allows an attacker to steal your credentials. That was kind of big. In addition to that so there's multiple. If you read the Lenovo advisory, and I covered this on Hack Naked this week, and I think it deserves more attention, because you got to go into the Lenovo report, and it says that sensitive data stored by the fingerprint manager, including the Windows logon credentials, is encrypted using a weak algorithm. Separate from that, contains a hard-coded password and is accessible to all users with non-local administrative access. Those are three completely different problems that could be combined, but it makes this advisory for me really, really bad.
Yeah, I mean, to the extent that when I read it, I was like, okay, hard-coded password, bad. And then I started reading further, and I was like, ooh, fingerprint data, worse. Credentials to the system, also really bad. And from a non-local admin, like, it's the trifecta of badness.
It is, and I think that was downplayed in the news, certainly, if you didn't go read the Lenovo advisory. So make sure before you make a risk assessment on this, make sure you go read it, because it looks like there was some really crappy code that ended up in this fingerprint reader that you probably need to put it higher on your priority list than it appears on the surface.
For sure. So wrapping up here in the last two stories that I wanted to cover in the food for thought section, the first one that as a result of all the news we've been talking about, is cybersecurity salaries are on the rise. And in this case, the article is specifically to the UK, but as much as 7% in 2018. So good time to be getting into security, to say the least. What do you think, Paul?
Yeah, I think that's good, right? I like money. You like money. We should hang out. It's an idiocracy reference for you.
For sure.
I did find a story, Keith, that came from Tenable, actually, and it was titled, I don't know if you saw this, I added it to the show notes at the last minute and then forgot to tell you about it. 3 reasons why DevOps is a game changer for security. Now, I think that we need, and they were trying to offer a high level here with a link to a white paper that I'm sure goes into more detail, but I disagree slightly with the way numbers 1 and 2 were presented, because I think it downplays or it doesn't paint the whole picture for how microservices and DevOps certainly is helpful when it comes to security. And number 1 is built-in security. And I don't think that DevOps in itself is built-in security. I think that it's a process that allows you to build security into it. The article made it seem like, it was just built in. Like, hey, if you have DevOps, you're magically secure. Now, okay, so yes, if you do follow the DevOps procedures, there are inherent security benefits. I also think that there's a different side to that says to get security into a DevOps environment, you have to put some of those controls in place, and it's a process that allows you to do that more easily than previous processes we had. The second was automation. Automation is great, but automation by itself doesn't paint the whole picture. I think it's the automation and orchestration and control that you can have over your development environments and pushing into production and your deployment process. It's that orchestration and control that's almost bigger for me than the automation. Like, sure, you can automate, but what are you automating? You're automating the control and orchestration and what all those things are doing. To me, that's more power. Like, what you automate is more powerful than just saying, well, DevOps allows for automation. Third point I agreed with, it does have proactive prevention. I think the inherent in the DevOps process itself allows you to just inherently gain more proactiveness when it comes to preventing things being built in your application that could lead to integrity issues, not just security. I don't know what you think about that. I don't mean to pick on the article from Tenable. Obviously, I used to work there, but I just wanted to expand on their points.
It is interesting because when you think about built-in security, right? DevOps by itself doesn't have built-in security, but it allows for different points at which you can add security into that build process.
Right.
Usually by way of point 2, automation. So when you have a pipeline that is going ahead and building out your application, for example, or you've pushed code into GitHub, it then does the build to make sure that you haven't broken anything from a QA, QC standpoint for unit tests and integration tests. But then also you can add security testing on top of that. The things that it allows you to address perhaps a little bit more readily is architectural problems. To the extent that DevOps moves quickly and to some extent breaks things, and then you have to go fix them, it allows you to actually have some more control over that architectural process and being proactive. So I agree with you. Point 3 is spot on in terms of, yeah, you can actually think about how you're going to build things using microservices, using Docker containers, using all these other things that allow you to have those inherent protections that come with just the way that those things are functional, the way that they are intended to work.
Well, and that's a good point. Yeah. I think people will jump to, well, DevOps just allows you to build, if you're going to build crappy software, DevOps allows you to build crappy software much faster. And if you're going to build insecure software, you can do that much faster and at scale and have way more crappy and insecure software. But, you know, in that process, it allows you to fix the crappy insecure software much more quickly and efficiently. So,
and identify configuration changes too. So to the extent that you might be deploying a server using Docker, for example, and you're deploying it insecurely, well, guess what? You go ahead and change one configuration and, you know, relaunch that server accordingly or replace it in production. You're secure. Like the impact that you can have as a security professional in the DevOps world is 10x if you know what you're doing and where you're going to apply it.
It's the opportunity to do that, I think, is kind of the point I wanted to underscore with the article, because I think it's good that companies are promoting these ideas that we're talking about on the show with respects to DevOps and containers and the getting away from some of the traditional development practices. But I want to make sure that we understand it as an opportunity, not necessarily a silver bullet.
For sure, for sure. And in fact, speaking of silver bullets, I just wanted to highlight article number 2 under Food for Thought. I don't know if you got a chance to check it out. It's What the F is My Information Security Strategy? I warn you, it's got explicit lyrics on the page, so be careful on where you browse to it.
Like that's the actual website.
Yeah. So you go to it. And if you click on like the different security strategies, it will give you a strategy. So for example, this one is eliminate risk by masking data across the organization by embracing agile development practices and enforcing secure coding frameworks. Sounds pretty good.
So it's like a random quote generator that generates you what your security strategy is, because mine ended up being invest in virtualization of security appliances to reduce risk and promote governance of identity assurance. So like I can use this during our shows when I want to sound smart. I can just go here and say, well, you know, your security strategy should be.
Yeah. Right, exactly.
I got it.
Perfect.
I'm going to totally, I'm bookmarking this right now. This is how I'm going to sound smarter on the show.
So needless to say, if you need to sound smart about security and you're a developer, well, go ahead and, spin this up. Make sure maybe you do it off hours or on your personal device just because of the language they use on the site. And you too can be a security marketing professional.
It's awesome. There's a button that says I've already effing used that one. Great. Oh, well, thank you everyone for listening and watching Application Security Weekly. Make sure you monitor vendor access and restrict personal use of computing resources by removing admin rights on critical assets. And on that note, we'll see you next time.
Remember to git commit and stay